Okay. Are we ready? We're ready. We're so looking forward to this, Hamish. We've been waiting for it all day.
Sure. Good afternoon. I know heavy after a lunchtime session, lots of numbers, but I'll try and paint a bit of a picture for you and share some of the information relating to our population demographics, and in particular our latest 2023 update from the series of data that we get, and kind of highlight some of the what does that mean and links around it. But I also thought I'd take the opportunity today to take you through a tool that we have that is quite helpful in providing some information, census-related information, and how you might be able to break that down and use the data for your own interests or some of your interests from some community members. So I'll work through a bit of a presentation outlining, I was going to focus on the people and places tool first, and then I'll focus on our latest population and dwelling forecasts, and then happy to take questions at the end. So first of all, I'm not sure how many people might be familiar with our people and places tool, but hopefully you can get a live link, or I might be able to show you a live demonstration at the end if we have some time. But a couple of years ago, we had a new provider come on board to help support what used to be undertaken by one provider. We used to get a bit of historic census information available through our website, so the public and any interested users could kind of delve into historic information and some key makeup of the district, and also with our population projections. And a couple of years ago, with changing providers, we've actually broken into two different tools now. So we have a supplier who provides our population projections information, and we also have another supplier who provides this tool I'm going to demonstrate to you now. So People and Places is a joint effort that's been developed across all the districts across the Wellington region, and Greater Wellington help work with us to kind of coordinate the delivery of the services provided. So you'll see there through the actual website itself, and I've just got some screenshots here, so apologies it's not overly interactive, but you'll see that there's a kind of a tile to go into each of the council's own census related information, but this is publicly available, so if you were interested in understanding some of the breakdown across some of our neighbouring councils. This doesn't have Horowhenua District Council at this point in time, but it might do in future. So this is predates some current work where we're working jointly with them. But essentially, what the website provides, if you delve down to Kapiti Coast District's tile, is it actually provides all the Census 2018 data and broken down by our district council area. So you'll see there when you go into the website, it actually provides a map of the locality and the district scales, and this one I'm going to start with is just to provide a district level level of information, and it's very similar for those who might be familiar with dialing up some of the Statistics New Zealand Information Over Places profile as well, so it's a little bit similar to that. But you'll see on the screen there, you'll see the map of the district, and you'll see across to the top left, and I apologise for the size of it, hopefully on the presentation when you download or going live to the link you'll see, but there's some tiles on the left hand side that talk about people, work and place, and this includes some of the breakdowns of the census information around the actual population and ethnicity, which is looking backwards facing across census periods. Includes some of the work, so the employment and incomes, household incomes, personal incomes from across the district, and also the places include some of the housing and households and dwellings information as well. So this is a place where you can go to access if you want to know, as of the points of last censuses, how many houses were there in the district, or what was the income, the district average income. You can go find this kind of information through this website, and it provides all that information there in one place. And you'll see there just on the landing page, it provides, for instance, a couple of kind of commonly sought areas just as kind of given references. So you'll see there it's got the population number of the last census, the median age of the district, population, unemployment levels at that point in time, and also some information about where people come from to the district. So just a little bit of context. And one of the key things that the website can also do, as well as providing district information, it can also break down and provide that same information across what's known as an SA2 area. So that's a statistical unit area 2, which is essentially, I've kind of called it, it's like a suburb area as an example. So up there, just as a map, I just happened to capture a screenshot of Otaki, and you'll see Otaki there that's highlighted in the blue map. Of course, Otaki Beach is between the coast in there, and that's another SA2 area, so it's got its own data and own information for that unit area. So the entire district is broken up, I think, of at least 32, I think it is, of these SA2 areas. So it provides a bit more granularity of the breakdown and the information. I think there was a question just before about interest in and around Tohoro, for instance. So there'll be an SA2 in and around the Tohoro area as well, but some of those can be broken down further under the census data, but this is a kind of a nice kind of spatial breakdown to help people understand some of the differences across the district. One of the other things that the website does as well is it helps provide some benchmark and changes, and that's quite often, I've heard at the table a number of times, interest around what's the changes across the district as a whole, but also some of those suburban areas, the SA2 areas. And so some of the functionality we have as part of the tool enables us to compare. If you look here, and again, apologies for the screen, it actually provides a comparison. You can set the benchmark to the district. So this is looking at what the population in Otaki is compared to Kapiti Coast District, and using the 2013 census year. And you'll see here up on screen, it brings up the numbers for the Otaki area, and then it also has the comparison of percentages for the wider district next to it. And this example also shows the dwelling numbers as well. So you can see the numbers and actual percentage of the total district for those SA2 areas. So again, the links will be available as part of this presentation, and I do have it at the end. If we do have some time, I can jump in and show you a little bit more functionality. But I just thought that's quite helpful, because I know there's a lot of questions coming up around some of the makeup, particularly in light of some of the visioning work that you'll be doing and discussions with your communities. It's a helpful tool to direct others to, but also if you have some interest yourself and quite easier to navigate than some of the depth of the Statistics New Zealand sites and the data itself. So hopefully that's of some information to you for those who might not have been aware of it, and happy to provide a bit further information if helpful on that as well.
Because it's quite a big difference, eh?
It's a great place to live, and women have better taste.
Well, yeah, that's what I put. That's what personally I thought. Yeah, I just wasn't sure. But I mean, that's a 5% difference is a really significant population difference. So I wondered if the
As we got more older people and women live longer.
yeah.
That's a great summary.
Yeah.
Both examples.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Sorry.
And as you've touched on, some of this information is really helpful to understand some of the profile of the district when we talk about its makeup and kind of what that means for different needs. And it also varies across the district as well. So I can touch on a little bit of those differences as part of the population projections as well, and how they come through in some of the high-level district numbers. But there's a wealth of information in that space. And I was actually going to say, we do, kind of shooting to my last slide about next steps, there will be a bit more layered information that comes through. I'm due to give you a briefing in a month or two around our housing business assessment work. So I'll give you a bit more flavour and get into a little bit more breakdown around some of the households and demographic and housing side of mix, as well as some of the business side of things as well when we come back. So this is kind of a bit of a stepping stone, but there's a lot of interesting depth in there as well.
One other quick one. In terms of like the dwellings and household income, etc., how far does it drill down? Like at one stage, areas of Waikanai Beach and Paraparaumu Beach there were a lot of empty houses. They were holiday homes.
Yeah, got ahead.
So they don't represent much in the way of income, obviously, per household unit. So is that factored in? Like if there's nobody there, so there is no household income for that unit, except but it drags it down.
No, the average.
Yep.
Drags the average down.
Yeah.
I couldn't comment specifically on the annual average income, but I know on census night they have what's occupied and unoccupied, and they also do capture and reflect the level of vacant dwellings. And so for us, that typically represents, and particularly a lot of our beachside settlements, has relatively high levels of vacancy compared to typical urban areas. And that's a particular part of the profile of Kapiti and where it's come from historically, particularly Waikanai Beach, Otaki Beach, and also some of the Tohoro Peka Peka area have higher levels of vacancy for the second homes, weekender, and that's certainly something I'll touch on as part of the HBA as well, because it's part of the profile and understanding where the demand's coming from, how much housing stock's available, how it might be being used.
Yeah. Cool.
So really the main show of today is to give you a little bit of background on the population forecasts. And again, there's a live link on this page. Hopefully it works on your sets, and that'll take you through to, again, the link on our webpage, which goes off to a supporting, again, our population forecasts. This is the area that's been recently updated to include Horowhenua as well as part of the Wellington Regional districts, and that reflects the approach that we're taking with the Wellington Regional Growth Framework, which spreads beyond the Wellington region to include our neighbours to the north. Essentially, the projections provide a set of consistent information across a number of areas. You'll see there the population, household makeup, ages, and migration. And this is all looking to the future. So what I just showed you before about the census is the actual information captured from census looking backwards, broken down into a lot more detail and a lot more categorisation. This is a bit of a lighter touch, but picks up on some key parameters looking to the future for the next 30 years. And that's quite important because this is pivotal information to help us plan for the future and what that means. And I'll come on to touch on some of the caveats and kind of unders and overs with taking that approach. But that's the distinction between the two things that I have spoken about and will now go through for our future population forecasts. So just a bit, first of all, when I mentioned before we had a new provider, in 2021, Sense Partners were selected from across the region as the new provider for our demographic projections going forward. They are a consultancy based in town and kind of provide a number and range of economic services and modelling forecasting services to Treasury and to a number of other organisations, so have some pretty good history in this area. And they came on board after a process, a very thorough market sounding process in 2020, where it's quite competitive, and they came through as a preferred supplier. And since then, they've developed the product in replacement of the previous provider that we had for across the region. And they provided their first projection in 2021. And I'll touch on some of the components that's included in that as part of the 2023 projections. And I guess the key thing I just wanted to note that extends across all the districts. One of the key reasons for having a consistent approach is so that across the region and our spatial area, we're actually comparing apples with apples. And that's a very important component, rather than every district council going and acquiring their own projections and information quite often tells a very different story across the piece. So that's part of why the districts have worked together for a number of years now to provide consistent services, but also consistent information for regional wide planning across our districts. So quite important. Another key point of importance is that this is, I guess, the last update, well, hopefully, fingers crossed, touching wood, the last update we'll be doing ahead of the next availability of census data. So the census does provide quite an important line in the sand for a lot of core information and how it's captured. While Statistics New Zealand captures quite a lot of information in interim periods, it undertakes a lot of estimates and other information exercises itself with a mind to the next census actually filling in and providing more robust certainty what's happened in interim periods. Of course, when we think census periods take 5 years at a chunk, there's a lot of importance that we continue to plan and understand what's happening between the 5 years, but really bringing it back and understanding that 5 year period is quite important. So that's why the census 2023 will be quite an important component for us, particularly given that COVID is quite a key event that's occurred within the last 2 census periods, and I'll give a bit more context over some of the changes in previous projections in a few slides' time.
How much delay are you expecting for that data to flow through 2023 census data? Because normally, can take quite a while, right?
I'll touch on that towards the end, but yeah, I don't want to steal all my thunder in one go, but yeah,
Sorry.
I'll touch on that a little bit because that's about the core next steps, but it's a good point. So one of the core things I just wanted to highlight, and it reflects back to why we commission separate projections, is Statistics New Zealand do provide a set of projections as well. They got sub-national projections, and they show some growth out to the future across some of the similar parameters. I guess one of the key reasons why the Wellington region as a whole has historically gone out and acquired, as well as providing that consistency of information and more detailed inputs to the information across its councils. One of the key things identified in this slide is that there quite often is some difference in assumptions undertaken between national planning growth by Statistics New Zealand versus some of the growth undertaken by previous providers. And I think that's highlighted here, and this is a slide taken from Sense Partners updates that just show that one of the key factors that shows some differences between the growth that we're planning for across the Wellington region versus the Statistics New Zealand projections that they do is based in and around some assumptions, in particular around migration, which is quite a key factor of growth in Wellington. And I guess this is where, as a region, Wellington's quite unique in that it's a centre of government. And as part of that, it's got quite an interesting profile around how it grows, and that it actually attracts with that depth of skills and also the industry and other supporting services that go with government being based in Wellington. It's actually got quite interesting profile where it draws in a lot of international people or people with migration from elsewhere into New Zealand into Wellington, and also international people. And that's actually got a really important footprint itself for Kapiti, because Kapiti also has quite a unique footprint where we actually gain more than most other districts from international people coming here, choosing to settle here, because of the proximity to Wellington and the lifestyle reasons being a couple of the key drivers that we've previously identified. But this is just to highlight that while there are a range of other projections out there, why we commission and use the Sense Partners projections is because of some of those subtleties where they do tailor them to the Wellington drivers and also some of the district-specific drivers where they work with us and get some of the data inputs and what's going on the ground affected into their projections as well.
If I can just ask, you're right in terms of where the assumptions come from make a huge difference to what these predictions look like. In terms of our growth strategy, is that factored in by Stats New Zealand, or is that completely outside that? And I suppose that's one part of it. The other part is too, once you've actually got the, you've gone past the date, you can actually see what was budgeted or what was predicted and what actually happened, and how much of a disparity is there.
Yep, both good questions. I've made a note of them both. In 2 slides' time, I'll remember to talk to them, and if I don't, please prompt me again. But I've made a note to pick up on both of those, because I've got a graph that shows some of the predicted growth and some of the changes, and I'll use that as context to explain it, if that's okay. Thank you.
Isn't it?
What's that, sorry?
It's a very large coffin.
So I just thought before I get into that, some of the context around the methodology as well, just around the approach that Sense Partners take, I thought I'd explain, because their model has 4 components. The first component up there, A, is the people. So that's about our births and deaths, which is quite important, and alluding to some of the trends and statistics about male versus female, length of life, birth rates and ratios is all the stuff that goes in this component of the model and modelling, but also the international inputs that come from elsewhere, all core components into the understanding the people components of the model. There's also a supporting work component. So the model also looks at the attraction factors for work and also people, and as a bit of a driver. So obviously Wellington's got some of those interesting mixes as well, and drivers for the work and associations, type of industry changes. That's other factors that go alongside as part of the population projections. Then we have the C over the other side, and this is the household. And again, I've got a few slides time that breaks this down a little bit, but this is interesting because it helps us understand what is the mix of people. And you'll see from some of our slides in a few minutes, there are some key differences in what that can look like within our district anyway, and it can look different in other districts as well. But that's the makeup, and what's the makeup of those households. And then the last one is, what does that then mean for housing? So obviously, depending on how many small families or independent alone people you have will then determine, in theory, how many dwellings you have. So this is where we use, it's a good example of where we use this information to try and understand what is the mix of the community that we know, and what does that mean for the potential availability and the type of housing we may need to meet their needs through the work we do.
So that also works the other way around. So the kind of housing that you have will determine to some extent the kind of people that you're going to get as well, right? So if you're just building housing for those who are here, we would just keep building retirement villages. If we want young families, etc., we need to be ahead of that to attract them, right? So it's just the inverse of that same process.
Build it and they shall come kind of thing.
That's the theory.
It's a very pertinent point that I will be emphasising later across a range of scenarios as well. So, yep. The last thing I was going to just mention on the slide is that the approach taken is it's a nationally balanced model. So they actually they don't just look at Wellington, assume, Wellington's amazing and therefore it's going to grow independently. So what they actually do is they look at all the inputs into New Zealand as a national model. They actually model a lot of the other locations and regions and changes and swings and shifts across the region, and then focus within our district as well. So it's a very robust model that Sense Partners use to then come up with our numbers, and how they kind of interrelate and reflect to each other, and those relationships is really important underneath it. And so this is actually, as I mentioned, this is the latest, this is the second update they've done from their first baseline in 2021, and I'll explain this, and then the next slide shows some of those differences that we explained earlier. But I guess this is looking at the demand, so not the supply of housing in the first instance. So it's looking at those population drivers, what's happening with the changes, and what does that mean. And the way Sense Partners provide it, their modelling is into a number of percentiles you'll see there. So there's starting with the 25th, which is the lowest percentile, up to the, or there's the 5th actually, sorry, is the lowest, and then the 25th, 50th, 75th, 95th. And it just provides some ranges and some statistical probabilities about growth over time going forward. And you'll see there that the latest update goes out to 2054. So just a smidge beyond 30 years. And that's to help inform our upcoming planning processes. But the most important thing to note here is, and the next slide shows it both, but we use the 50th percentile as an ease, I guess, but Sense Partners always advise that we should use ranges to plan between, because it's a bit hard to just say one line's going to happen and that's where it falls. There's a number of factors that can determine that, and that's the percentiles. But we use the 50th percentile as a easy reference point. And you'll see there that in the latest update, they're looking at essentially 81,000 over the next 30 years. Now that's quite a little bit of a drop from where we have been, and the next slide provides the previous growth strategy number as a comparison. And there's a bit of explanation as to why that has occurred. But you'll see there that the proportionality of that growth is relatively, you'll see it's balanced off a little bit in the middle. Just in and around this point here, and there's a reason for that I'm sure we can all guess. But just to also highlight that the last little blip in the historic, this is our historic growth rate, and you'll see here there's a little buttoning off in this period here, and then it increases from 2012 up. If you remember the housing information I've shown you previously, is a little thing called the GFC that occurred in 2008, and that's where that plateau there has come from. I know it's very slight on the screen. But you'll see that growth rate over that period there, that's also equated to along a 30-year average, I think it was, from the growth strategy when we calculated, is 1.5% annual average increase in growth over the last 30 years. And it's a bit less for the latest update. So just comparing with the 2021, and this is the baseline, the first baseline produced, and this is the baseline that was in the growth strategy. So the growth strategy had just under 32,000 expected growth forecast by, I think it was 2051, it's up there. And that would have brought us to a total population of about 90,000 by that 2051 point in time. And so on this screen, and I apologise for the colours, it's a bit mixed up, but you'll see the growth strategy line is the solid orange line up the top there, and you'll see the current 2023 projection is just a nudge down below, and you'll see it's essentially like 12,000 people less and over a slightly longer period. So it's a proportionate shift, but the interesting thing to notice is that when I said about planning and looking at ranges of growth, you'll see that the old growth strategy line that was 50 percentile at the time is pretty much not too different to where we're currently looking at a 75th percentile. So just keep that in mind as to some of the reasons why. And I guess the key difference you'll see here in particular is there's quite strong growth through this period here. It's continued, whereas the lapse there. And again, it won't be much of a surprise as to the reasons why, but COVID has obviously had a significant impact on our growth, and in particular the shutting of the borders over the COVID periods. Coming back to the drivers of immigration, migration being quite key, critical ones for Wellington, but also Kapiti, that is the primary contributor to that dip in growth for our growth for those few years, but also seeing that distributed out across the remaining 30-year periods had a bit of an impact as well. There were some slight adjustments that Sense Partners have made to their modelling to reflect a nationally ageing population, which they've also reflected through all the districts' information as well, because of course that's quite a key component of our national population is the post-baby boom coming into semi-retirement and what that means as well, and how that iterates through. But in particular, you'll see Kapiti, there's an example up there of the impact of the minus down just under a percentage point from domestic net migration. So that's there's a big trend of people from Wellington coming out here, either for lifestyle or to retire, but also people who come to settle in Wellington to work internationally coming to settle in Kapiti as well. So if we kind of anecdotally link that to the close of borders, that could be quite a key contributing factor to that drop. That said, I think I've mentioned before, anecdotally, during the start of COVID, there was quite high pressures and demand for housing on the coast, where a lot of people were seeking those choices and flexibilities in how they live and work and play. So again, this data it can't talk to that specifically, but that's where the census data will hopefully tell us where this lies, because that'll give us a much clearer line in the sand about how many actually people are here as of the last census. So talking to that profile of Kapiti, this slide shows us our future projections out to 2054, and this shows the numbers of population by age as of 2054 in the orange, and the 2018 census data is in the blue below. So some of the key trends you'll see there, just starting with the blue, I guess a key, I think I've spoken about it previously, a key factor in Kapiti is that we tend to have a bit of a gouging or a gap for young persons, and that can be a number of reasons, including going off to education somewhere else or moving to the city. So Wellington actually does not have this. It actually does quite well in the young persons, because that's a lot of people co-locate to the larger cities and centres for lifestyle and job opportunities. So it just shows a bit of a difference. Again, another key attribute of ours in Kapiti District is that we have quite a high rate of older persons, but also in that later life as well. And so that's anecdotally attributed to kind of people semi-retired moving out here for lifestyle while still working back in Wellington or not. And then also people choosing to retire in Kapiti as well. And you'll see in the forecasts, nationally there's a significant increase in the ageing population, but Kapiti has a higher proportion than most councils of older persons. And so that's shown in that change. There's actually growth across all sectors of ages. If you see here, there's actually a growth in children under 12 or under 15 as well, but then it dips off again, and it's projected. But you'll see this gap in here shows where there's growth. So the most growth, of course, is coming through in this period here, where people are getting to retire, semi-retirement age, and as it moves along, and then people living out longer because it's extended out to the right-hand side of the graph. And so some of that reflects that national trend of that ageing population living longer, but also Kapiti's got a higher proportion share than a lot of other councils because of our profiles and drivers.
Sorry, Hamish, I wondered just how much, I'm a bit disappointed to see it only goes to 99. I had expectations, especially beyond that. But is this just natural numbers as opposed to any kind of socially engineered numbers? So, for instance, if you had, I don't know, Splash Planet here, or if you had, fantastic facilities for young that would attract young people, that you could dramatically change the demographic.
Yes.
For instance.
Yes. Yep.
But this doesn't.
I've got a slide and a couple of slides that
sorry.
talks this point, but it's another good point about it's very based on historic information, but does take into account a number of other trends and information available at a point in time. Tries to project some of that forward, but it's certainly a long-term trend using some of that historic factors. So it is open, and that's why we update it frequently, not too frequently sometimes, but to reflect some of those changes over time.
So you might want to think about it along the lines of assuming the current offerings in this community, this is what it looks like. So we haven't assumed that we've done anything massively different. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm a little bit confused by the graph. With the number of population. So say you've got that line between 0 and 3. How many lots of 780 or so are you adding up? Is there one for each year, or is there one for 0 and one for 3? Or how does it work?
I think
Am
it's
I
just
being
showing
stupid?
just the scale. It should be the numbers. Oh.
No, I think you'd be going babies who are just been born at 0 times whatever their number is, 792,
It
and
could be
then you'd
0
and then
if you
you'd be
times
one
it,
for 1,
fine.
2, 3. So we get to the number 3, and it says, oh, the number of 3-year-olds we have, there's about 800 of those. So you'd have to add up all the age groups and times them by the number that's set out in the trend line on the graph to get a total number for the community in that year. So it's like a snapshot of ages in 2018 versus 2054. So
No,
that's
I don't think so.
it is, isn't it? It is.
Yep.
It's the age of people in 2054
It's,
versus the age of people in 2018.
Yeah.
So you would literally.
Okay. No, I want to focus on the rest of the presentation. Thank you. I won't obsess over that graph. Can you help me, Lawrence?
No. Graphs are always fun. Data's always fun. You can make it say whatever you want. I was just talking with Sophie. I find it really interesting that college age, we're decreasing steadily over the whole of college age in the forecast. Whereas I think what we've got in that blue line is what we should be forecasting, a similar sort of a thing where you've got straight through college age and then it drops from 18 to 21. I don't know where they're getting that prediction from, because most of the time, from a long time in the college and education area, we're pretty steady on our numbers through that education time. And growing slightly over time in that area, and then a sharp drop off, not a steady decline like that.
Right.
I just don't think that prediction makes sense in terms of what we have in Kapiti.
I think we'd have to go back and look at it. Otherwise, I'd be saying to you they're all going to boarding school and they don't live in Kapiti during that period. But I'd be making that up. But
There is and you're right. There is a small percentage that go off to boarding school during college, but not the number that you're talking about there. It's a way too dramatic drop
We'd
off
have to go back and have a look at it. Essentially, yeah.
from nigh on 800 down to 700 by the time you get to 18. It's quite a drop off.
Yep, I can follow up.
Yeah, we'd have to follow up.
Yeah.
So it'll be where the data sources come from and
Well,
if
that's a prediction. So they're predicting
Well,
that we're going to change our population dynamic that much.
2018 would be as at.
Yes.
So that would be, if that came from, for example, the census, it might reflect on the information that was collected through that period. And it might be that those people, they aren't here. There is the drop off, that it is go down. So we can inquire and come back to you. Yeah.
Just doesn't make
Looks
sense.
to me like they've just averaged out the shape.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We were
Just-
just going.
just
They've made a
smoothed
nice
it?
wave. Made a
Yeah.
nice wave.
Yeah.
I feel like that's really unlikely, but we'll come back to you
It's
because
a-
if they're doing that with graphs, I've got a
It's
I've got a
2054. It's a forecast, so of course they've smoothed it.
But the orange one I accept, but not the blue one because that should be actuals. So
Yeah, the blue one goes.
Well, that
tick,
makes
tick, tick,
sense
tick,
that
tick.
it's actuals.
Yeah,
To
but
me, that looks way more realistic.
Because you
The
get the
blue
sharp
one.
drop off at 18 when they leave school.
Yeah,
Then it comes back up again
yeah.
when they presumably drop out of university in their first year.
we'll come back to you.
Like the blue one.
Let's
looks
move on.
absolutely
I'm
realistic
sorry
for our
to
demographics.
stall
So the
us.
blue one should reflect the census. Well, it coincides with the last census
How are we
information,
going-
so that should be more accurate
How are we
data.
going for time? We've
But
got
the
another
orange
15
is a
minutes.
projection, so as you say, projections tends to get run and smooth. So there will be some smoothing in there. I can inquire because that's part of the process we do is to
Okay.
look at what comes in and gets factored out.
Cool.
So it would be interesting. So we'll follow up on that because there might be
Thank you.
something there, or it might be again longitudinal
Maybe,
processes.
maybe they're predicting that Kita's plan for putting education out
Well,
here actually
well.
affects our 18 to 21.
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. Everyone's jumping today. So the other thing I should have said, just coming back to the fit with the growth strategy, the numbers use the historic demand as the grower. They don't look at the land available. They do allocate some of the supply for where that might occur, but they don't actually use supply as the driver for where the growth could go. So that comes back to how we mentioned we're using a consistent process across the councils. If every council said, this is the land we've got for growth or something, it turns into a bit of a bun fight about who's got the most, and when in fact actually people will go where preference is over and above that. So when we talk about the growth strategy, these are the numbers that we use alongside the development capacity to make that assessment of how the two meet, but it's not necessarily the growth that then drives the type of housing, that point as well that came up before. So there's a bit of a distinction, they kind of sit alongside each other. A bit more breakdown, just to provide a bit more of the context, but again, this is based on that kind of backwards facing and where we've come from. Again, the last census actually saw, previously we used to have a household, our previous providers had a household size of 2.3, and the last census actually bumped it up to 2.5. Slightly, so that would the only assumption we could take from that was there's a few more families and kind of family size units to get those numbers up. And this, in fact, is the latest projections actually see that tipping down to 2.3. It's already about 2.3 under our projections, but they actually see that now falling a little bit further to 2.2, and that reflects some of the adjustments that have been made across the region as a whole. As a whole, region seem to have been ageing a bit, which then flows through to the household sizes. As a whole. Ours is a bit lower, for example, than say Porirua, because we have a lot of single occupant or couples with no children households, compared to Porirua has a lot of larger family size households, as an example. So there's some differences when you start looking across the districts. And as you'll see there, just playing out, I've got the 2018 and 2054 in the top table, just shows that there's a slight drop in some of the household sizes with families compared to the household sizes that are non-family, couple without children, multi-person or single occupant houses, gain a little bit over the next 30 years. But interestingly enough, if you look in the bottom table, what I was trying to show in there is that while that's what's happening with the households and some swings and shifts, if you look at the total population, it's about 50%, roughly about 50% of the population is in a family household, versus 50% of the population is in a non-family household, so children with children. And you'll see that that slightly readjusts again from just above 50%, it's 53% in 2018, and that's predicted to dip just below at 48% in 30 years' time. So that again reflects that ageing population as people go through the cycle, and also some of the birth rates are falling in New Zealand in parts. Of course, that looks different in the district. We have a higher birth rate up in to the north of the district versus to the south of the district, as an example. So lots of swings and shifts, but just some interesting changes. But as we said before, these can change in time. They're a point in time, and there can be factors that kind of influence that. And a good example, I was just going to touch on our growing the workforce, as mentioned. Some interesting statistics here, just to show that, again, the workforce is projected to increase as well with that population growth overall in time. You'll see there it's expected to increase over 30 years by about 15,000, but actually the percentage share of working workforce is expected to dip a bit. And again, that's because of that increasing older population. You'll see there the 70%, over 70% age group of the population moving from 17% to about 25% is an attributing factor. But this is a really good point, and actually where some of the work that we're doing can actually change what future statistics look like and influence them. Because at the moment, you'll be aware that we've got some of the work going on around education hubs, and that work rolling out across the district, offering more training opportunities to others and potential in time for them to stay and work from home, flexibility. But also there's the opportunity here with that ageing workforce, the assumptions about what age does someone come out of the workforce, or do they work longer? And we've got some of the work in there looking at the opportunities around the 65 plus workforce in Kapiti, and how we can better leverage and use that, particularly with the strength that we've got in that area in the district.
Does it include our volunteer workforce or just paid work?
That's a good question. I guess the projections themselves are just looking at the working age population. We can look into that, because we do know that's a significant part.
Particularly for over 70s.
I
I'm
see
thinking
what
of
you're
all the
saying.
work that the men's shed do. You know, they're actually employed, basically. You know, they've built a food bank for us, pretty much.
So for the work we're doing, we can definitely come back and give you some information on that. These numbers here will be both. So I think the other thing that Hamish and I were talking about in the background is the likelihood of the definition of working age in the population is likely to shift over time.
Yeah.
So as you'll know, it's currently up to 65. The likelihood of that extending to who knows where, maybe 70, is high, if not further than that. And so I think over time, that's going to make a big difference to how we might think about the capability and capacity we have in this district.
And notwithstanding those French riots, which I'm sure will bear in mind when the government tries to increase that. But for a lot of older people, there is a trend now we're seeing. A lot of older people are continuing in work, not by choice, but by necessity, just economic deprivation. So how much of an overlay is there of current economic trends? You can't. It's difficult to take demographics in isolation from each other, right? So that most people will tell you in this field that the primary driver is money. So what's the financial situation? So that drives people in and out of workforces. Right? So if you can afford to retire earlier, people generally do. If you can't, they don't. And given that we have an ageing all the demographics show that we are going to have a continued ageing population. We keep building these retirement villages, and so there's a greater need for those people to stay in the workforce. So I'm just wondering how that fits into this.
I would have to have a look. I can have a chat with the forecasters. There's a range of assumptions that they do have on the website. I think reflecting some of the discussions we've had earlier with the smoothing, there's likely to be some assumptions and caveats made in kind of 30 years' time what that looks like. So I'll try and find the details for you, and I'll refer it on.
I think though when the census data comes through, that will be a really sensible point to understand the shift since 2018. So ideally, we should have seen a movement that helps us understand, the extent to which there's, I'm assuming, more people over the age of 65 staying in work. And so we would know that, and that would inform the assumptions. So, I mean, Hamish hasn't said this, but I will. I think the reality is once we get this next sort of download of census data, the assumptions that we have in these models could conceivably change quite a bit, because 5 years is a long time, and you're still working off the best information you have. So that becomes your one source of the truth.
Just before you move on from that, can I just ask a question about employment and workforces, etc.? Are you looking at the impact on the availability of commercial land? Because just as you look at population in relation to residential housing, are we also looking at the relationship between population and commercial land? Because I was talking to a commercial real estate guy the other day, and he said one of the biggest constraints for economic development in Kapiti is the lack of availability of commercial land. That he has people constantly approaching him who want to build, big factories or buildings or, retail spaces, whatever, but they can't find anywhere to put them. So are we, to what extent are we looking at that kind of relationship and how that relates back to workforce? Because, again, it's that same thing of if there's no land here to put, commercial operations on, that's going to reduce the employment opportunities and make it less attractive for people of working age to come to our area.
So Hamish was just saying to me, when we bring back the HBA assessment, we'll have that in there. I think the other side of that is that we've obviously got the economic development strategy up for review, and I think that would be an important factor that we need to be bringing into the mix, because of the work that's currently underway, that is not a focus area for what the team or the EDKB is doing, but we can add that in. So I think it would be something that we put on a list of things that we come back to you on.
Sure.
Cheers, thanks, Chris. And as mentioned, that HBA will be coming back and looking at the balance of what the projected growth looks like, and that's demand for business land by types of industry. We've got broken down in there, but also for the housing side of things as well, by the types and nature of dwellings being looked for. And that's where we use some of these projections compared against what's on the ground to say, where are we? So it's it goes a bit further to that discussion, but may not have the full detail, but certainly an area of interest. So that'll be coming back in a month or two. And again, this slide here just shows from that information that we have, as we said, we kind of show a profile of the dwelling requirements, and that it also breaks down to the SA2s, going back to earlier, how some of the census information is available. We also have some of the information available by the SA2 area, and so this shows a bit of a profile of what the dwelling demands look like alongside the population growth over the short, medium and long term. The short term being 3 months, the medium term being 3 years, medium term being the 10-year period, and the last being kind of the full 30-year period, or the last 20 years of that. And some of this does take into account what is currently available and where some of the growth and development. So this is where some of the supply side does help identify where the location of growth goes, rather than dictate how much. So that is where some of the supply side comes in. So that just gives you a little bit of a profile of how that matches some of the locations across the district with areas of activity.
So if I can just ask a question there, you've got Waikanae's divided into 4 areas. Can you just define where Waikanae West is and Waikanae Park? I assume Waikanae East is over the railway line?
Waikanae West, I got this wrong the other day. Waikanae West is on the hill, north of the old state highway, to the bottom of the hill. Waikanae East is to below that, Charles Fleming area, kind of across in a big smear. Oh, other way? Oh, sorry, got it. Sorry, I had it right there.
East is east
Yes.
and west is west.
Yes.
Okay.
West is towards the sea, I keep reminding
I
myself.
stand corrected, thank you. And then we've got Waikanae Park is essentially kind of the expressway runs through the middle of it. So it's the Narara area and a little bit of the other side. And then you've got Waikanae Beach, which is parallel to, obviously, the Waikanae Beach area.
Okay.
Another 4 locations. Apologies for getting back to front.
That's okay. So thank you for that. So these additional dwellings, does this include rest homes or not?
It includes some of the areas of current greenfield activity and zoned land, and also other areas of development activity, such as infill around here, will be factors that are kind of considerations into their projections.
So the other question too, which I know we've talked about before, if you go back to slide 16, the one on page 16, it's showing a reduction in the number of people living in houses, and there's nothing here that talks about the size of these dwellings, and whether it's so you're probably going to have lots of houses that might be occupied, but they're not as fully occupied as they could be. And in terms of new growth, is there? Well, there's no discussion. Well, I suppose there's whether or not they're going to be small to accommodate those people. But then, what happens if these trends change?
And that's a point where we talk about in the housing business assessment. We come back again. We just use some of the information around household sizes and preferences against some of the market delivery, just to show that there is that mixed match. But that's where some of the work around the housing needs has gone further, because it's spoken and engaged in a lot more detail to identify those needs, to again kind of confirm the differences between sometimes what is being driven by the market, but what the needs are for a household, they don't necessarily meet in the middle. And so that's about choice, and where the choice has been fully enabled. And coming back to Chris's point and Councillor Wilson's, I guess if that need could be met, it could look quite a bit different in the future too. So that chicken and egg slightly.
Just show us where we need to build the cemeteries.
Well, there is a plan for one. Mike and I accepted
Oh,
the
well,
land
you gotta
yet.
build- you gotta have them somewhere.
So this is second to last slide, but this is kind of like the warning, I guess, that came through, and we saw the impacts of COVID, how it's kind of suppressed the spread, the growth numbers into the future and brought it down a little bit. As soon as the projections had come out, the update for this year, we were issued with an accompanying slide, which you kind of see here, which actually shows the opening up of the borders and the impact that's had. You've probably actually heard this from a number of political, economic commentators and stuff already, about how the numbers have already significantly increased, as well as people going offshore to Australia. There's a large number of people starting to come to New Zealand as well. And so that line, that dotted line in the graph on the right-hand side, you can see where the data was pulled to update the latest projections. And then to the right, you can see the significant increase in growth in people coming into the country since then. So this is just a kind of that warning, I guess, from Sense Partners about that long-term process. And they always indicate using a range, and coming back to think about that 50th percentile, but the 70th percentile is quite close to where we were looking to go pre-COVID. And just how we think about that going forward is going to be important, because if that growth does continue to come on as we were experiencing pre-COVID, that's quite a lot. A lot was happening. We've had Transmission Gully open up, and now we've got more flexibility for where people want to live, if they can and do have a choice, which is another question again. So that just really is a lot to say. Just important that we continue to take that medium to long-term view to planning and investment, with the infrastructure required and all that. That stuff doesn't happen quickly. So it's important we continue to keep an eye on the future, as well as recognising some of those short-term shifts and changes. So it's a little bit of how do we do both. And the last slide is really just to say that we'll be updating some of this information's already recently been made available, but we provide a bit of a summary on our own webpage, as well as what sits on the regional webpage. So we'll be looking to put that live in the next week or two. This will be the basis of the information, as well as any other information that might come out will help feed into the long-term planned thinking. But again, you'll be updated on the assumptions and what that looks like as part of that process. As already mentioned and touched on a couple of times, we've got the briefing coming up on demand and supply, which will provide a little bit more granular comparison about what does it mean across the district, and what's the growth we need, and what's actually on the ground and what's occurring. A bit more of kind of how does it all meet and what does that look like. Again, big thing that we've already identified is the importance of that Census 2023 data. I did touch base this morning with the person who helps provide our projections, and they indicated that the earliest we're potentially looking for is May next year, and that's already shifted. As some of you, I think, mentioned at the last session we had, they're already still collecting census data at the moment, so hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get it for that time next year to update the next iterations of our projections and come back with some analysis of some of those actual shifts and changes within that last 5 year, particularly that COVID period. And the last thing just to touch on when we came to talk about the housing is it's further work underway just to develop not only the data but some of these reporting tools, but how we can bring some of these strands of data and information together in a much more helpful way to kind of support some of the discussions and interests we've heard at the table today, which go beyond just a future projection, but what's happening on the ground. And so that's part of our planning work at the moment, supporting some of the outcomes work that we're looking to do and how we can kind of support those discussions and decisions going forward. So there's a live link there at the end to our webpage that's just a landing for the population projections, and you'll see there's little highlighted links within it to those tools as well. But happy to take any further questions there might be.
Well, we're going to take one question from Jocelyn, one from Martin, and we'll finish up because we're already running a little bit late. And a question and then an answer, not back for comment, thanks.
Sorry, I don't have a question.
Great.
Excellent, I
That's
get
even
two.
better.
I'll
You
take
get two then.
Look, actually, just a bit of clarity on one of them. It says in the dwellings, you've got non-private dwellings as a heading. I was just curious, what does that mean? Is that like Kaingoa housing or something?
It says occupied, unoccupied, and private, non-private.
Yeah, non-private can be anything from hospitals. So that could account for some of the retirement care facilities where people are in permanent care, or it can also account for, my understanding is, jails. I don't think we have those here. But yeah, so some of those kind of other alternative types
That's
of...
cool. The other one was, look, I noticed you've got Māori in there, but there doesn't seem to be any delineation between, say, one's a Māori that whakapapa to the area versus, or mana whenua, versus Māori that don't whakapapa to the area, or mātawaka as such. And I was just wondering whether that's a statistic that's available at all.
Is that part of the tool? Are you online? In the
Yeah,
tool?
I've had a look.
Oh, sorry. I just thought it was part of the graphs.
Yeah.
I do believe that there was a census question last time in the 2018 census, or it might have been 2013 census, that did delineate.
Oh,
But
okay.
I can't remember if it was repeated consistently.
couldn't see it
They
there
changed it, which made it quite difficult.
So we won't be able to get that through Sense Partner. They would be making a wide range of assumptions around that, which would mean it wasn't meaningful. So the next time, assuming that the census has reasonable information to share around that, would be through the census information. So we'd get it every 5 years, essentially.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, Hamish. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Do people want a quick 2-minute leg stretch, or are you happy to just box on?
A leg stretch would be useful for the team, so we can just get
Leg stretch would be useful for the team, so they can get themselves organised. Come back at 5:02 on the dot.
And it seems anecdotally, everyone tells me that mostly Filipinos who work there. So do they provide accommodation for those workers?
Good question. Did he come to the answers to your questions, by the way? I wanted to check.